The Proto-Indo-Europeans were the hypothetical speakers of the Proto-Indo-European language, a reconstructed prehistoric language of Eurasia. Knowledge of them comes chiefly from the linguistic reconstruction, along with material evidence from archaeology and archaeogenetics. According to some archaeologists, Pi speakers cannot be assumed to have been a single, identifiable people or tribe, but were a group of loosely related populations ancestral to the later, still partially prehistoric, Bronze Age Indo-Europeans. This view is held especially by those archaeologists who believed it to be an original homeland of vast extent and immense time depth. However, this view is not shared by linguists, as proto-languages, like all languages before modern transport and communication, occupied small geographical areas over a limited time span, and were spoken by a set of close-knit communities, a tribe in the broad sense. The Proto-Indo-Europeans likely lived during the late Neolithic, or roughly the 4th millennium BC. Mainstream scholarship places them in the forest steppe zone immediately to the north of the western end of the Pontic-Caspian steppe in Eastern Europe. Some archaeologists would extend the time depth of Pi to the Middle Neolithic or even the Early Neolithic, and suggest alternative location hypotheses. By the early 2nd millennium BC, offshoots of the Proto-Indo-Europeans had reached far and wide across Eurasia, including Anatolia, the Aegean, Western Europe, the edges of Central Asia, and southern Siberia. The Proto-Indo-Europeans were in the past referred to by many scholars as Aryans. Culture. The following basic traits of the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their environment are widely agreed upon but still hypothetical due to their reconstructed nature. Pastoralism, including domesticated cattle, horses, and dogs. Agriculture and cereal cultivation, including technology commonly ascribed to late Neolithic farming communities, e.g., the plough. A climate with winter snow. Transportation by or across water. The solid wheel, used for wagons, but not yet chariots with spoked wheels. Worship of a sky god, * Dios ph tuter, Zeus, * Dew ph tuter greater than Latin Jupiter, Illyrian Diapatoros. Oral heroic poetry or song lyrics that used stock phrases such as imperishable fame. A patrilineal kinship system based on relationships between men. The Proto-Indo-Europeans had a patrilineal society, relying largely on agriculture, but partly on animal husbandry, notably of cattle and sheep. They had domesticated horses * equus. The cow played a central role in religion and mythology as well as in daily life. A man's wealth would have been measured by the number of his animals * piku. They practiced a polytheistic religion centered on sacrificial rites, probably administered by a priestly caste. Burials in barrows or tomb chambers apply to the Kurgan culture, in accordance with the original version of the Kurgan Hypothesis, but not to the previous Surodni stock culture, which is also generally associated with Pi. Important leaders would have been buried with their belongings in kurgans, and possibly also with members of their households or wives. Many Indo-European societies know a threefold division of priests, a warrior class, and a class of peasants or husbandmen. Georges Dumézil has suggested such a division for Proto-Indo-European society. If there was a separate class of warriors, it probably consisted of single young men. They would have followed a separate warrior code unacceptable in the society outside their peer group. Traces of initiation rites in several Indo-European societies suggest that this group identified itself with wolves or dogs. As for technology, reconstruction indicates a culture of the late Neolithic bordering on the early Bronze Age, with tools and weapons very likely composed of natural bronze. Silver and gold were known, but not silver smelting, thus suggesting that silver was imported. Sheep were kept for wool, and textiles were woven. The wheel was known, certainly for ox-drawn wagons. History of research. Researchers have made many attempts to identify particular prehistoric cultures with the Proto-Indo-European speaking peoples, but all such theories remained speculative. Any attempt to identify an actual people with an unattested language depends on a sound reconstruction of that language that allows identification of cultural concepts and environmental factors associated with particular cultures. The scholars of the 19th century who first tackled the question of the Indo-Europeans' original homeland had essentially only linguistic evidence. They attempted a rough localization by reconstructing the names of plants and animals as well as the culture and technology. The scholarly opinions became basically divided between a European hypothesis, positing migration from Europe to Asia, and an Asian hypothesis, holding that the migration took place in the opposite direction. In the early 20th century, the question became associated with the expansion of a supposed Aryan race. The question remains contentious within some flavors of ethnic nationalism. A series of major advances occurred in the 1970s due to the convergence of several factors. First, the radiocarbon dating method had become sufficiently inexpensive to be applied on a mass scale. Through dendrochronology, prehistorians could calibrate radiocarbon dates to a much higher degree of accuracy. And finally, before the 1970s, parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia had been off-limits to Western scholars, while non-Western archaeologists did not have access to publication in Western peer-reviewed journals. The pioneering work of Maria Gimbutas, assisted by Colin Renfrew, at least partly addressed this problem by organizing expeditions and arranging for more academic collaboration between Western and non-Western scholars. The Kurgan Hypothesis, as of 2014, update. The most widely held theory, depends on linguistic and archaeological evidence, but is not universally accepted. It suggests bi-origin in the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the Chalcolithic. A minority of scholars prefers the Anatolian Hypothesis, suggesting an origin in Anatolia during the Neolithic. Other theories have only marginal scholarly support. In regard to terminology, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the term Aryan was used to refer to the Proto-Indo-Europeans and their descendants, though the term more properly applies to the Indo-European branch that settled Persia and India. It came to be used for the broader ethnic family. By the early 20th century, this term had come to be widely used in a racist context, referring to a hypothesized white master race, culminating with the pogroms of the Nazis in Europe. Subsequently, the term Aryan as a general term for Indo-Europeans has been largely abandoned by scholars. Heimat hypotheses. Researchers have put forward a great variety of proposed locations for the first speakers of Proto-Indo-European. Few of these hypotheses have survived scrutiny by academic specialists in Indo-European studies sufficiently well to be included in modern academic debate. The three remaining contenders are summarized here. In 1956, Maria Gimbutas first proposed the Kurgan Hypothesis. The name originates from the Kurgans of the Eurasian steppes. The hypothesis suggests that the Indo-Europeans, a nomadic tribe of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, expanded in several waves during the 3rd millennium BC. Their expansion coincided with the taming of the horse. Leaving archaeological signs of their presence, they subjugated the peaceful European Neolithic farmers of Gimbutas' Old Europe. As Gimbutas' beliefs evolved, she put increasing emphasis on the patriarchal, patrilinear nature of the invading culture, sharply contrasting it with the supposedly egalitarian, if not matrilinear culture of the invaded, to a point of formulating essentially feminist archaeology. A modified form of this theory by J.P. Mallory, dating the migrations earlier and putting less insistence on their violent or quasi-military nature, remains the most widely held view of the Proto-Indo-European expansion. The Anatolian hypothesis proposes that the Indo-European languages spread peacefully into Europe from Asia Minor from around 7000 BCE with the advance of farming. The leading propagator of the theory is Colin Renfrew. The culture of the Indo-Europeans is inferred by linguistic reconstruction raises difficulties for this theory, since early Neolithic cultures had neither the horse, nor the wheel, nor metal, terms for all of which are securely reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European. Renfrew dismisses this argument, comparing such reconstructions to a theory that the presence of the word café in all modern Romance languages implies that the ancient Romans had cafés too. The linguistic counter-argument to this might state that whereas there can be no clear Proto-Romance reconstruction of the word café, according to historical linguistic methodology, words such as wheel in the Indo-European languages clearly point to an archaic form of the Proto-language. Another argument against Renfrew is the fact that ancient Anatolia is known to have been inhabited by non-Indo-European Caucasian-speaking peoples, namely the Hattians, the Georgian Chalybes, and the Hurons. Using stochastic models of word evolution to study the presence or absence of different words across Indo-European languages, Gray and Atkinson suggested that the origin of Indo-European goes back about 8,500 years, the first split being that of Hittite from the rest. Supporting the Indo-Hittite hypothesis, they attempt to avoid one problem associated with traditional glottochronology, that of linguistic borrowing. However, they inherit the main problems of glottochronology, including the lack of proof that languages have a steady rate of lexical replacement. Their calculations rely entirely on Swadesh lists, and while the results are quite robust for well-attested branches, the crucial calculation of the age of Hittite rests on a 200-word Swadesh list of a single language. A more recent paper analyzing 24 mostly ancient languages, including 3 Anatolian languages, produced the same time estimates and an early Anatolian split. These claims remain controversial, however, and most traditional linguists consider these methods too inaccurate to prove the Anatolian hypothesis. The Armenian hypothesis, based on the glottalized theory, suggests that the Proto-Indo-European language was spoken during the 4th millennium BCE in the Armenian highland. It is an Indo-Hittite model and does not include the Anatolian languages in its scenario. The phonological peculiarities of pipe proposed in the glottalized theory would be best preserved in the Armenian language and the Germanic languages, the former assuming the role of the dialect which remained in situ, implied to be particularly archaic in spite of its late attestation. Proto-Greek would be practically equivalent to Mycenaean Greek and would date to the 17th century BCE, closely associating Greek migration to Greece with the Indo-Aryan migration to India at about the same time. The Armenian hypothesis argues for the latest possible date of Proto-Indo-European, a full millennium later than the mainstream Kurgan hypothesis. In this, it figures as an opposite to the Anatolian hypothesis, in spite of the geographical proximity of the respective heimat and suggested, diverging from the timeframe suggested there by a full 3 millennia. Genetics. The rise of archaeogenetic evidence which uses genetic analysis to trace migration patterns also added new elements to the origins puzzle. In terms of genetics, the subclade R1A1A is the most commonly associated with Indo-European speakers, although the subclade R1B1A has also been linked to the centum branch of Indo-European. The subclade's parent Y chromosome DNA haplogroup R1A1 is thought to have originated in either the Eurasian steppe or the Indus Valley. The mutations that characterize haplogroup R1A occurred till 10,000 years BP. Its defining mutation occurred about 10,000 to 14,000 years ago. Ornella Semino al. propose a post-glacial spread of the R1A1 haplogroup from north of the Black Sea during the time of the late glacial maximum, which was subsequently magnified by the expansion of the Kurgan culture into Europe and eastward. Data so far collected indicate that there are two widely separated areas of high frequency, one in Eastern Europe, around Poland and the Russian core, and the other in South Asia, around North India. The historical and prehistoric possible reasons for this are the subject of ongoing discussion and attention amongst population geneticists and genetic genealogists, and are considered to be of potential interest to linguists and archaeologists also. Out of 10 human male remains assigned to the Andronovo horizon from the Krasnoyarsk region, 9 possess the R1A chromosome haplogroup and 1 CM130 haplogroup. mtDNA haplogroups of 9 individuals assigned to the same Andronovo horizon and region were as follows: U4, U2E, U5A1, Z, T1, T4, H, and K2B. Furthermore, 90% of the Bronze Age period mtDNA haplogroups were of West Eurasian origin, and the study determined that at least 60% of the individuals overall had light hair and blue or green eyes. A 2004 study also established that during the Bronze Age, Iron Age period, the majority of the population of Kazakhstan was of West Eurasian origin, and that prior to the 13th–7th centuries BCE, all samples from Kazakhstan belonged to European lineages. Luigi Luca Cavalli Sforza and Alberto Piazza argue that Renfrew and Gimbutas reinforce rather than contradict each other. Cavalli Sforza states that, it is clear that, genetically speaking, peoples of the Kurgan steppe descended at least in part from people of the Middle East and Neolithic who immigrated there from Turkey. Piazza and Cavalli Sforza state that, if the expansions began at 9,500 years ago from Anatolia and at 6,000 years ago from the Yamnaya culture region, then a 3,500-year period elapsed during their migration to the Volga-Don region from Anatolia, probably through the Balkans. There a completely new, mostly pastoral culture developed under the stimulus of an environment unfavorable to standard agriculture, but offering new attractive possibilities. Our hypothesis is, therefore, that Indo-European languages derived from a secondary expansion from the Yamnaya culture region after the Neolithic farmers, possibly coming from Anatolia and settled there, developing pastoral nomadism. Was published in 2015 of DNA from 94 skeletons from Europe and Russia aged between 3,000–8,000 years old. Researchers concluded that about 4,500 years ago there was a major influx into Europe of Yamna culture people originating from the Pontic-Caspian steppe north of the Black Sea, and that the DNA of Copper Age Europeans matched that of the Yamna. The forecorded where people could trace an astonishing 3/4 of their ancestry to the Yamnaya, according to the paper. That suggests a massive migration of Yamnaya people from their steppe homeland into Eastern Europe about 4,500 years ago when the corded ware culture began, perhaps carrying an early form of Indo-European language. Spencer Wells suggests in a study that the origin, distribution and age of the R1A1 haplotype points to an ancient migration, possibly corresponding to the spread by the Kurgan people in their expansion across the Eurasian steppe around 3000 BCE. About his old teacher Cavalli Sforza's proposal, Wells states that, there is nothing to contradict this model, although the genetic patterns do not provide clear support either, and instead argues that the evidence is much stronger for Gimbutas' model. While we see substantial genetic and archaeological evidence for an Indo-European migration originating in the southern Russian steppes, there is little evidence for a similarly massive Indo-European migration from the Middle East to Europe. One possibility is that, as a much earlier migration, the genetic signals carried by Indo-European speaking farmers may simply have dispersed over the years. There is clearly some genetic evidence for migration from the Middle East, as Cavalier-Sforza and his colleagues showed. But the signal is not strong enough for us to trace the distribution of Neolithic languages throughout the entirety of Indo-European-speaking Europe.